Hello everybody. Just going to wait a little while and see if anybody's going to actually join me this morning. I know it was very short notice. Hello. I don't know what's going on, why I'm so bright today. I'm going to try and move around a little bit. Welcome everybody. This is going to be a bit of an experiment, and it's really the first time that I've ever done a kind of live session like this. So I have done them a couple of times with others who have been conducting their own, but I have no idea how this really works, so you have to bear with me a little bit. The idea of this morning is that every month, once a month, I run a group called The Village, which is in North London, in East Finchley. And usually we have a group of around 10 to 12, almost always mums, who come along to learn about some kind of topic related to parenting or psychology. Hi everybody who's joining. And I've just had so many messages from people saying, I'd love to come along, the topic sounds really useful, but I can't get there. And always, you know, even if you're in North London, sometimes it's really hard to get here because of childcare or working, or just wanting to spend time with your partners or your children. So I thought we would see what it feels like to do a kind of online village. And what I'll be doing is probably once a month I'll come on and talk about a particular topic. And there's also a Facebook group that has always been attached to the North London Village, so you are all really welcome to come along and join that too. And that can be a bit more of a kind of discussion group, so if people have got particular questions or issues or ideas that have come up, it would be really nice if we could then continue these conversations outside of this space and in what is a kind of private, moderated Facebook group. But what is unusual for me about doing it online is that usually when I do these things with a group of people in a room, obviously we have a lot of discussion. People ask questions, there's lots of discussion about sharing their own experiences too. So please feel free to ask questions. I'll try and keep checking in the comments if I can. And if there's anything that I talk about that you just feel like, actually, I didn't quite get that, or I want to know a little bit more about that, then you're always really welcome to just send me a direct message after this. Or if there's something that you wanted to ask but you didn't want to ask it in this kind of public forum. So I will say that as well. So we obviously are on Instagram, so there's zero confidentiality on here. And just be mindful, if you are asking questions, that you're happy for them to be shared in a kind of wider group. So I'll try and put this onto my highlights after we've had this discussion. I'd love it if this, we'll see if this works, but if those of you who are kind of watching could just let me know a little bit as we go through about what it is that you're hoping to get from a kind of forum like this. So is there anything in particular that you would like me to be talking about? You're really welcome to introduce yourselves. I know you'll have to do that by typing, which obviously isn't as personal as if we could all just talk together, but do feel free to contribute, ask questions, introduce yourself, say a little bit about what's brought you here. That would be really great. And the hope is really that we can get a bit of a community going, even though we're online. So for those people who've just joined, we're going to be talking this morning about, well, actually I haven't even said this, yes. So yesterday we talked at our village meet in East Finchley about transitions. So we were talking about how in September kids quite often go a little bit nutty, and how that can impact on them, and also how it impacts on us as their parents. And often for parents too, you know, we might not have been able to take off a whole summer break, but we probably have had a time that we've had holidays with our children, we've had holidays with the family, and all of a sudden September feels like autumn's suddenly here. Everything kind of ramps up again very quickly. Depending on what kind of work you do, September can often actually be a really busy time as people are preparing for Christmas. After the summer holidays in business, often people then kind of come back and really want to get things going again. So if you've got kids who are starting at nursery or preschool or with childcare, and you might be also trying to get back into work, it can feel like a really quite a manic time. And what we know is that at those times, what will always happen is that there will be a kind of emotional fallout from that. Hi to those of you who are just joining. So I thought what I'd do today is just give you a little bit of information about some of the ideas that we talked about last night, some of the kind of key themes that came up. And I also thought if people would be interested, I did some stories a few days ago about help seeking, so how it feels to ask for help. And I've had so many messages from people talking about their experiences of asking for help and sometimes being met with resistance or not actually getting the help that they really wanted. So if people would find that useful, we can talk about that a little bit too. For those people who are just joining, do feel free to introduce yourself if you want to say a little bit about what's brought you here. Do say a little bit about, kind of any particular issues or difficulties that you're facing at the moment. I'll just repeat that we just do have to be mindful of confidentiality, because obviously this is a public forum, so don't type anything that you aren't happy to be shared in a kind of wider group. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about what we talked about last night. So last night we had a really lovely clinical psychologist called Avital Perlman, who works alongside somebody that you might know who's on here a lot as well, who her handle is Parenthood in Mind. She's called Julianne Bouteleb, and she is a perinatal psychologist. And Avi Perlman also works as a perinatal psychologist, but she sees children and families too. So her background is in children and family, mental health, and in paediatrics. So she's really well placed to talk about this kind of period in September when so many transitions are going on. And one of the questions that or the sort of analogies that she pointed out last night, was just for all of us to really think about how it feels for you when you start a new job or you're going into any kind of a new social grouping, and how you feel when you get home in those kind of first few weeks, let's say, of a new job, where you might be walking into a new office. You don't know the kind of environment that you're in, you don't know what the people are going to be like, you don't even know who you're going to eat lunch with, are there nice places to get lunch around there, don't really know very much about the kind of work that you'll be doing. Hi Jess, thank you for introducing yourself. I'd love it if other people feel free to introduce themselves too. That would be great, so we can actually feel like we're having a conversation and it's not just me wittering onto you. So she was talking about how that feels for us even as adults, and the fact that, as adults, generally speaking, we have pretty good impulse control, so we can hold on to those feelings of discomfort without it affecting us too much. But, the thinking about all of those things that happen to us if we're in a new job, how we then feel when we get home in the evening, and often all we want to do is just sit on the sofa, maybe zone out with a bit of TV, not really talk to anybody, and just have a chance to kind of regroup. And she pointed out that often we have a very different expectation of our children. So, hi Melanie, lovely to meet you. We often have a really different expectation of our children, so our children are walking into a new environment, and even if it's not the first day that they're going to school, every September there will be new transitions, there are new expectations on them. They might also be walking into kind of historically difficult social situations. So September for all kids, and Avi really pointed out last night that this happens every September for the whole of their school career. That is going to be an anxiety-provoking time. And what we often expect from our children is that they will then kind of come home, or they'll go on play dates, or they'll go to after-school clubs, and then when they come home they'll just kind of be able to manage as they always did. And we can often be quite surprised at actually just how emotional our children can be in these kind of first weeks back at school, and even goes on up to university. And as I was saying, for all of us, it goes on at every point in our lives where we face a really big transition. There will naturally be a kind of emotional repercussion from that. And one of the things that we talked about yesterday was just how difficult it can be for all of us, that our children, because they just don't have that kind of emotional language yet and can't really verbalise how they're feeling, Hi, Emma. I'm just going to read what you're saying. Too many transitions for you. You started work after a 4-year break after cancer and kids. And started a new preschool. You've stopped breastfeeding your boy and started sertraline. That is a lot to deal with. I'm really glad that you're here with us. Everybody do please keep contributing, keep chatting. It's what will make this feel like more of a community rather than me just talking. Emma, it sounds really like you are ready for a weekend after all of that. I hope that's some of the things that we'll be talking about today you'll find helpful. So just going back to thinking about kind of how our children will respond to that. What we kind of expect is that they will say, oh, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, or, actually it's just all a bit too much. But of course they don't do that. What they do is they say that you've made them the wrong kind of sandwiches, or that they don't want to put their school shoes on, or that they won't brush their teeth, or they won't have a bath. There's, the key sort of things that often happen with kids is that you might have bedtime issues. There might be night waking again. Sometimes children start bedwetting at this time again, particularly the little ones. And maybe once they get older, like I'm talking sort of 8, 9, 10, they might be able to start articulating to you, oh, actually, I've had a bit of a hard day. But even then, they'll probably be a bit grumpy. And in the same way that actually we are too. If we've had a really hard day at work, we don't come home and straight away say, oh, I had a really crappy day today. I had conflict with so-and-so, or I just had too much work on. I didn't understand what it was that I was meant to be doing. Actually, often we do the same thing. We come home, maybe we're a bit moody, maybe we're a bit quiet. And often it's only once we've had a chance to kind of unwind and process that we'll get to that point where we're able to say to our partner or friends or family, oh, that was really tough. That really took it out of me. And sometimes we don't even get there. So we're expecting a lot from our kids, really, when we can't do that translation for them. Let's see. I must remember how much I used to hate my mum bombarding me with questions when I got home. That's so interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So this was something that came up last night as well. Let's see, all of this is happening with my little girl. She's like a different kid. How do I talk to her? Okay, so let's come on to that. I'm going to make a note of that. So how do we actually support our kids? How do we support, our kids and asking questions about school? Yeah, so where were we? So thinking about those kind of emotional fallouts and how kids express it. And I mean, it would be really great, actually, if some of you maybe would say just actually how your kids demonstrate their anxiety about school. A mum said to me earlier this week, my child hasn't shown any anxiety, actually. She's been really excited about starting school, but she stopped eating. And it's that kind of link that we have to make, that sometimes what looks like difficult behaviour or challenging behaviour is actually sadness or anxiety. And in many ways, it's up to us to then translate what we think might be going on. I just want to say a little bit about why this is so difficult. So why is it that we find transitions so hard when we're kids, when we're adults? And if you think about what it's like for kids every year when they're kind of stepping up into a new school year, or going to nursery, or meeting a new kind of childcare person, there will be different expectations on them, and they don't always know what those expectations are going to be. And often, because, especially if kids have been at nursery and then they go up to school and there are far fewer teachers or caregivers there for them, they might have had a kind of attachment bond with a key worker at nursery, or a childminder or a nanny, and then all of a sudden they've actually got to hold quite a lot within themselves, because there's only 1 or 2 adults available for what can be 30 kids. So in many ways, actually, that is a really different expectation. Are you going to be able to hold on to those emotions at school until you feel like you're in a safe enough environment to let them go? So that's a big expectation for our kids. Mine has started joining in, telling off her brother, almost like she's trying to take control a bit. That's a big one. So thinking about what are the ways that kids will demonstrate their anxiety. So trying to take control. My little boy, not at school yet. He goes to preschool. I started dropping him off this week. I had a big break of dropping him off after the birth of my second child. Okay, me dropping him instead of dad has made him anxious about being left again. So we're talking about control. We're talking about, all of those things that kids might do, like saying, I'm not going to put my school shoes on, that is a way of them demonstrating to you, actually, the reason that the kids are trying to get control is because they feel out of control. So, thinking about that link, and all of those little shifts, like even just you doing the drop off instead of his dad, kids, particularly around transitions, but most kids all the time, and some kids more than others, really thrive on predictability. So they want to know exactly what is happening every day, and all of those kind of daily routines that we can set in place for them do make it feel a little bit easier, so they kind of feel like, okay, school feels a little bit chaotic, I feel a little bit out of control and overwhelmed, but I know that when the teacher opens the door, mum is going to be there, or granny's going to be there, or my nanny's going to be there, or whoever's going to be there. And then we're going to do this, and then we're going to come home, and this is what's going to be for dinner, and then we're going to have a bath, and then we'll read stories, and then we'll go to bed. So if you can build, so I'm sort of slightly jumping ahead to thinking about what can help, if you can build those kind of really predictable routines around this kind of slightly overwhelming day that they're having, those are the kind of things that will just help them feel that little bit more in control. And often what we can do with our kids, it's something that's a kind of really common difficulty nowadays. We have much more understanding now as parents that we want to allow our children to feel a little bit more in control of their lives. So we often offer a lot of choices. And actually, sometimes for kids that can just feel really overwhelming when there's lots of other things going on that they're already overwhelmed by. And the reason for that is something that I've talked about many times before, is just what's going on in their brains. So what we know happens to all of us when we are stressed is that our frontal lobes tend to go offline. And it happens to all of us, but of course our frontal lobes are really well developed, and theirs are still developing. Our frontal lobes, which controls all of our executive functioning, like impulse control, planning, reasoning, all of those things that are kind of in this like really nice big bit of our brains at the front there, they don't finish developing until early adulthood. So kids actually just don't have the capacity to have the impulse control that we do. And what will happen when, they're kind of already very limited executive functioning goes offline because they're feeling stressed, is that all of their impulses just come out. So they're sort of in a state of emergency. They can't really think straight about what's going on. And often they'll kind of manage to hold on to that just until they see somebody that feels safe, and then they will let it all go. And really our kind of role as their parents or caregivers is to sometimes take on that function of being that frontal lobe for them. So being able to interpret that behaviour, also sometimes being able to kind of translate what's going on for them, and then kind of when they're calm enough to be able to give them the language to do that themselves later on. And that is, really a kind of lifelong process that happens. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't, if you've got more questions about that. And I've seen some questions coming in. So let me see. Do you think it would be helpful to have a daily routine chart so they can see each day what's going on? That might work for you. It's entirely individual, whatever will work for your family. Sometimes it's about just letting them know what's happening, and even just 2 or 3 things that they will kind of pin themselves onto. So it may just be, this is what we do when we leave the house, this is what happens when we come home. It depends on how organised you are. So at this time of the year, things are really stressful anyway. So if you feel like you're the kind of person who can make a routine chart and stick to it, then great. That might give them a little bit more of a sense of what's going on during the day. If that is just going to increase your stress levels, and actually you're somebody who prefers to be more flexible, then just do exactly what works for you. The science behind it makes it easier to understand and help support them and us. Exactly. Everybody's frontal lobes. It's useful to think about frontal lobes, because knowing that means that we know that it's not their fault. This is not something that they're able to control. Okay, so we talked about expectations changing and the impact that can have. So when they're feeling stressed about this overwhelm, about this expectations, that heightened stress level that will leave them with will just leave them that bit closer to flipping out. And there's a psychologist called Dan Siegel who has a great video on YouTube just about this, which I can link to, where he really explains what happens when that frontal lobe just goes completely offline and us and our kids are just being driven entirely by the amygdala, which is our kind of emergency system. So it's all about adrenaline and cortisol at that point, and all of those kind of reasoning, being able to think things through, that just goes off. And you probably can really relate to that if you think about times when you've been really stressed. And often, I love his work too. So he also wrote The Whole Brain Child, which is a book that I would really recommend. Yes, what was I saying? So it can really help us to understand. Sorry, I've slightly lost my track there. I'll come back to brains in a little bit. So because they're so stressed, that's what makes their brains. That's what makes the frontal lobes go offline. So it's just then about us understanding the reasons behind that and helping them to kind of get their frontal lobes, their limited frontal lobes, kind of back online. Okay, so the other thing that Avi mentioned last night at our village meet was around sometimes the things that can cause overwhelm at school are the things that we absolutely are to be expected. So new environments, new teachers, maybe different friendship groups, if they're starting a new school, that can cause anxieties in itself. But also, Avi talked a lot about how varied kids are in their kind of different developmental pathways. So often you really see that in the first kind of 1 to 3 years of primary school, so reception year 1 and year 2. There can be huge variation in the way that children are just in their kind of developmental stages. So you might get kids starting reception who can cut beautifully, who can read, who are able to write their names, who are kind of at that stage. You will also get kids there who do not have those kind of fine motor skills yet, don't yet know the alphabet, so that huge variation in their kind of academic development, but also then in terms of their social and emotional development. So you might also have children who actually are quite able to articulate their emotions at that time. So kids who have learnt that language, but also maybe are more able to express themselves emotionally. And then you'll also have kids who are more likely to act their emotions. So those kids who are still a bit hitty or bitey or kicky when they're feeling stressed. And then sort of from year 2, year 3, year 4, things sort of start to become like a little bit more similar again. And then again, what Avi pointed out was that at ages kind of 8, 9, 10 up, then you can start to see a lot of variation again. So she said, as a child psychologist, something that was really interesting for me, which was that her kind of the main points at which she will see families are, obviously in those kind of toddler years where there are a lot of challenges. Then again, around entering into primary school, we're thinking about how those transitions can affect behaviour. Then again, at around 8, 9 or 10, where developmental differences will start to become much more apparent. And what she said at this point, if there's any of you who are here with kind of kids around that age, was that at those different stages, what we can often do as parents is we kind of think, it'll probably just work itself out. We start to get to this point with school where we don't know a lot about what's happening in their daily life. Some teachers are better than others at communicating what's going on for our individual child. And for most schools in the UK, teachers are in charge of 30 kids. So, really good teachers do get to know each individual child, but it can be difficult. And Avi really emphasised the need to seek support immediately that you've got concerns. So whether that is to go and talk to the teacher, and there were a couple of teachers who were there at the village meet last night who really emphasised how helpful that can be when you've got an open line of communication.